Hello and welcome to this look at A.K. Warder's Grammar Guide, An Introduction to Pali. This week, in Lesson 13, we cover compounds and causative verbs. This is Pali Studies on the Learn Pali channel. So, let's start with compounds. Compound words are formed when two or more normally independent words are joined together to create a new word with a new meaning. The compound term then functions grammatically in a sentence as if it were a single word. The component members are usually in their basic stem forms, with the word as a whole taking inflection. And in Pali, the word normally takes the gender of the last term. The meaning of the compound, if it's your native language, may seem quite obvious, but it may not be immediately clear to a non-native speaker. Sometimes it may be simply the combination of the meanings of the words forming it, just if they were separate words in a sentence. But the term blackbird, for instance, refers to a specific species of bird, so has a meaning beyond that of its two member terms. And so grammarians have classified compounds into various types based on the relationship between their members. These classes are presented in various ways depending on which is seen as being a subset of the others. And in addition to these traditional groupings, there's what's termed syntactic compounds, which is a class added by Western scholarship. Now, contrary to Warder's statement that there are no English equivalent terms for these classes, I would say that in fact most classes have several, but with none being universally accepted. I'll list some of the more common ones here. Warder works through these classes one by one, and in Lesson 13 we're going to look at Taparissa compounds. These are usually called dependent determinative compounds, because the first member qualifies or defines the second, and the relationship between the member words can be expressed by one of the oblique noun cases. Here the first member bears a case relationship to the second, so these are also sometimes called case compounds. The first member can bear any case relation except nominative or vocative. And possibly the easiest way to work out the meaning of these compounds is to reverse the order of their members and insert one of the prepositional terms in English. The genitive case is actually by far the most common, as this is the usual case to express a relationship between two nouns. But since the case inflection between the two terms is dropped, we have to guess from context which one is correct. But it's when the final member is a participle that the other case relations are most often found. So, forest gone means gone to the forest, and Buddha spoken is spoken by the Buddha. Tree fallen, fallen from trees, and refuge going is going for refuge. Forest living, living in the forest. Very often the sense of compounds is intuitively evident. One may translate a passage in an acceptable way without knowing the exact classification. But at times it's obscure, and there are definite cases where misunderstanding of the type of compound can lead to mistranslation. So, as a general rule, the relationship between the elements is based on the context within which it's used. But once this relationship has been established, it will tend to retain this meaning throughout its usage in other contexts too. The principle of compounding words together is extended much further in Pali than it is in English. For instance, compounds can have more than two members, and we can also have compounds of compounds. And there are some important things to remember when we're trying to parse these compounds. Notice that it's the former members of the compound which qualify the last member. And it's also important to realise that the qualifying members give no indication of number. the uninflected members can stand for either the plural or the singular, and the inflection of the final member reflects how the compound as a whole is used in the sentence. They can act either as a subject or an object in their own right. Here it's an accusative case because it's the object of the verb. Or they can qualify another noun like an adjective. They can even be used as adverbs too. And finally, generally in Pali, compounds aren't separated into their individual parts. Some editors hyphenate them, but generally not. And the separate member stems are joined together following the rules of Sandy, and this can make them tricky sometimes to tease apart. Sandy is a big subject which I can't go into here, but if I'm having trouble with a compound, I'll use something like the digital Pali reader, which isn't foolproof but is a useful first attempt at dissecting compounds. And there's a link to that down in the description below. And one final point. Ward actually covers this at the end of the next lesson, lesson 14, but it really belongs here. And that is, the final member of some Taparissa compounds can be a specialised abbreviated form that only appears in compounds and is never found alone. So just to give a few examples, from the root ka, to do, we get an abbreviated form meaning doing, as in action doing. And as a substantive alone, this would mean a worker. Similarly, from the causative form of ka, we have making, as in pot making or a potter. And from the root da, as in dharma daro, we have doctrine holding or a memorizer of the doctrine. And tala tur, we have dry ground standing or standing on dry ground. Finally, pana haro is life-taking, or taking away life. And that will shorten the next lesson. Okay, so now we're going to move on and look at the conjugation of causative verbs, both their formation and their use. A causative verb, as the name implies, is one where someone or something is caused, ordered or instructed to act. And they roughly align with English verbs have done, make done and get done in a causal sense. He gets the student to obey the rules. Now, in Pali, the causative verb is marked by the infix e or ea, and these sometimes take a prefix of up. The a and ape forms are the most common, with the ea variants mainly found in poetry. And these infixes can be added to the present stem, but more frequently to the verbal root. If added to the present stem, we drop the final vowel of the stem, and although they can take any of the endings, the most common is ape. On the root, well, the available grammar guides vary quite a lot, probably because they, like myself, oversimplify. So here I am following Stephen Collins. Now, when the root ends in a long A, we insert a p to get pay or payer. Roots which end in vowels other than a long A, then the vowel is strengthened to the vridhi grade. And roots where the radical vowel is a short A, followed by a single consonant, they too generally strengthen to the vridhi grade. There are some exceptions, notably roots ending in a n or a m. While roots with a radical vowel other than A, followed by a single consonant, they are strengthened, but to the guna grade. And any root which ends in a double consonant, the root is left unchanged. And some verbs don't follow any of these rules. So the result of this is that many verbs have multiple causal forms. We can see that a distinctive mark is that arp sound, though this is often contracted to a and ea. And these forms then resemble the the 7th present stem verb class, which we looked at back in lesson 3. So quite often with causal verbs, context alone can tell us whether we're looking at an indicative or a causal. And inevitably this has led to a certain amount of disagreement among scholars over the proper classification in certain circumstances. Well, these are only the base forms, which then have to be inflected into a tense by person and number. And the causative verb is what's known as a secondary derivation. This means that actually it's a derivational affix which creates a separate verbal stem. And to this stem then any inflectional tense or mood ending can be applied. And the causal verb is quite frequent in Pali and can be found in all of the verb tenses and moods. It's also possible to compound secondary derivative affixes, so we can create what's called a passive causative verb. This is formed by joining the passive suffix ia that we saw back in lesson 9 to this causative base. The final vowel a of the causative base is dropped in favour of the e. This passive causative can then be rendered something like he is caused to do something by someone, placing it in the passive voice. Well, that covers the formation, so let's now move on to look at how the causal verb is actually used. In English, a causal sentence generally has the form A makes B do C. So we can see that there are two verbs corresponding to the causing and the action caused. And we can think of these as having their own subjects and objects. So A makes B for the first verb and B does C for the second verb. In this example, the noun phrase the student acts as both the object of the causal verb and the subject or agent of the action verb. And the action could also be intransitive, not requiring an object. So from these examples we can see that a causal sentence has one more object than a normal sentence. Now in Pali, the causal sentence has only the one verb. The causative verb in effect plays both roles. The causal infix can be seen as the make, get or have, whilst the root of the verb expresses the action being caused. The other important thing to understand is the noun marked in nominative case is the agent of the cause, whilst the person caused to act through whom the action is performed usually becomes an object in the accusative case, or it may rarely be treated as a passive agent in instrumental. And if the verb is transitive, then there will also be a second object in the accusative case. And finally, in Pali it's normal to have the verb at the end, so the normal ordering of a Pali sentence is subject, followed by the two objects, and then the verb. And if we quickly look at an intransitive example, so although this may look like a normal Pali sentence with a nominative, an accusative followed by a verb, it's important to realise that because the verb is causative, the object in accusative case is actually functioning as the subject of the verbal action. The mother gets her baby to sleep. And finally, although the literal meaning of a causative verb may be the straightforward causal one, quite often they take a more specialised or idiomatic meaning. So for instance, from the verb vach, to speak, the straight causative would be he makes speak, but it's used actually to mean he reads aloud or he recites. Whilst from the verb vad, to say, the straight causative would be he makes say, but it's used to mean he plays an instrument. In effect, he makes the instrument talk. So it's always a good idea to look up any causative verb in the dictionary before you make a judgment on its meaning. Well, I think that just about covers Lesson 13. Warder gives more vocabulary to learn, and don't forget there's a link down in the description to the Memorise flashcards. Then there's Exercise 13, and the answer to last week's Exercise 12 can be found on the Wisdom and Wonders website. Next week we go back to cover some more pronouns and look at a new verb mood. And of course, in the meantime, if you want to get ahead, check out the existing tutorials on these subjects.